Thanks to everyone who did join us. I know from some really helpful feedback from last time, as usual, there's a lot of information, typically not quite enough time to spend with it, and a lot of good questions. So I want to dive right in, and thank you so much for signing on tonight. Tonight is part 2 of a fun partnership with Fostering Together and OEO. So thanks again go out to Jill Mutchison for getting us set up with this. Part 1, we did an overview, kind of tried to look at evaluations and getting started for supports for students with disabilities, both with IEPs, Individualized Education Plans, and Section 504 plans. Tonight, we're going to focus in a little more specifically on troubleshooting issues around behavior, discipline, attendance, and academic progress. To get started, my name is Rose Spidell. I work with the Washington State Governor's Office of the Education Ombuds. It's quite a mouthful. You can call us OEO. And OEO is a small state agency that's been around since 2006. You've probably heard, if you joined us the first time and in other places, we are here to try to work statewide to ensure access for kids across our state to our state public schools, work collaboratively with families and schools to make that happen. We do that in a few different ways, working directly with families, working on trainings, and then working on policy. One of the key things here is that when we do these workshops and trainings, we try to give helpful information that you can take and use on your own. But we know that some of these situations get quite complex. There might be any number of variations of how they could play out or options you might want to consider or ask the district to consider with you. And so I really would invite you, if you're listening and you find that a question you have is not answered, please don't hesitate to reach out to us directly and see if we can connect and talk more specifically. You can call our general toll-free number, 1-866-297-2597. You can find us on our website or email us. So there you have it. And today, here is an overview of some of the behavior or discipline issues that I'm hoping we can touch on and go into a little bit. When I think about issues of behavior and discipline, I always feel like it's a little bit of a difficult topic to go into because on the one hand, just even describing it, it really seems to focus in on a child and whether a child is misbehaving. And one of the things over the years working here with OEO that I hear from educators and from families and people who work in the realm of behavior is that it's really helpful to understand that behavior is a form of communication. And sometimes through behavior, we communicate perfectly appropriately, right, with gestures or whatnot. And sometimes it comes up in a way that is not appropriate for school, but it still is communicating something that's important. And we also know that in our public schools, there's been data that's collected and reviewed, and it shows that we have a challenge to confront, which is to reduce the rate of discipline that removes kids from schools and to look hard and closely at disproportionate discipline rates that impact students of color, students with disabilities, other vulnerable students. This slide here that we're looking at kind of pulls out a few potential themes for us to talk about when I think about behavior and discipline, and particularly for kids who have an IEP and receive special ed services. So one of them, classroom removals. That's a big, new, important part of recently updated student discipline rules. That's when a student is removed from the classroom, but not removed from the school. Short-term suspensions, anything 10 days or less. Manifestation determinations. That's something specific that comes up when it's a child with a disability who is removed from school for 10 days or more, or for more than 10 days. And the rules require, both for children with an IEP and for children with a 504 plan, that a team gets together before the student is out for more than 10 days and takes a look, was the behavior that led to this disciplinary removal, was that behavior a manifestation, or in other words, caused by or substantially related to their disability? The reason we ask that question is because it would not be fair to punish a child because of a disability, right? It wouldn't be fair. It also wouldn't be effective because we need to more directly address the impact of the disability. So manifestation determinations come in when you're talking about removals for kids who have an IEP or a 504 plan, or who are suspected to need one. Another big piece here is functional behavior assessments and behavior intervention plans. Those are things that give you a more specific and close look at a child's behavior if it's been getting in the way of their learning or the learning of others. For a child who has an IEP, you can find behavior-related goals and specialized services that relate to behavior skills. And then sometimes when we're talking about behavior, it also becomes a conversation about what kind of environment or what kind of placement is appropriate for a student. And here, sometimes what happens is if a student is getting in trouble a lot or being removed from a general ed setting, sometimes that question comes up about what is the right placement. And it's important to be able to talk about and think about, are there ways to add accommodations or supports into that general ed setting to take a different look at the behavior so that they could stay there in that less restrictive environment, is what we call it, versus being removed from that environment and spending more time in a specialized setting away from peers with and without disabilities. So let me just, again, this is an overview. If you're listening and you're thinking there's a big area or question relating to behavior or discipline that you don't see here, throw it in the chat box if you'd like, and we can see if we can add some conversation about that. But I wanted to do a quick review of something we looked at in part 1, which is that when we're talking about supports or protections or rules around what to do, and particularly for a child with a disability who might have a 504 plan or an IEP, this slide includes the visual that is a ring of 3 circles, right? The outer circle is all students. Within that circle, in a smaller one, is students, all students, and among those, some of them have a disability that falls under the definition of Section 504, which is our federal anti-discrimination law that prohibits discrimination against students with disabilities, and it requires schools to provide an appropriate education, right? And the definition of disability under Section 504 is pretty broad, especially if you compare it to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or the IDEA, which is the law that gives us an IEP if a child is eligible. So again, the theme of this visual is that there are protections that apply in our schools to all kids. And then there are some particular protections under Section 504 to prohibit discrimination against kids with disabilities, defined as a child who has a mental or physical impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. So a fairly broad definition. Within that, there are some group of kids, some kids who meet the definition of a child with a disability that needs an IEP, needs specialized instruction. So every child who has an IEP, so meets that more narrow definition, is also a child who's protected by Section 504. Every child who has an IEP or who has a 504 plan is also a child who's protected by all the general protections that apply for kids in our public schools. Why review this? Well, because today we're going to talk about discipline and behavior. And one of the things that happened recently in our state is a significant revision to our state student discipline rules. These are rules that apply to all schools in our state, all public schools in our state, and they apply to all kids. And we will talk about, and there are some additional protections for kids with a 504 plan or an IEP. One of those is that requirement for the manifestation determination process. Okay, that's an additional requirement. Those requirements come on top of the protections and requirements that are in the general discipline rules. And this slide mostly just includes a bunch of links. Really what it does is encourages you to take a look at OSPI's student discipline page. If you're looking at or hearing about discipline issues, or if they're coming up, they have put together a lot of information, and they have new student discipline rule information. I didn't put it on here, and I should have. and one of the things we can navigate to is that we also updated our student discipline guide for families to incorporate the changes that have happened. It's a really long guide with a table of contents that hopefully will take you where you want to go. Some of the really key significant changes over the last couple years have been to limit the length of suspensions, long-term suspensions and expulsions. And in fact, recently, to limit the reasons why a student can be given a long-term suspension or expulsion. So now it's not totally just up to a school district. The state has said there are certain categories of behavior that are appropriate to potentially respond to with a long-term suspension or expulsion. But if you don't fit within that, you cannot use a long-term suspension or expulsion. One of those categories is behavior that adversely affects the health or safety of others, not particularly precise, so there still is some some area where you might be looking at whether this is something that could lead to a long-term suspension or expulsion. But the key thing is, anytime a long-term suspension or an expulsion is proposed for any student, that means anything more than 10 days, it has to fit within these categories that the state has said are the only reasons for which you can use that. The other thing is that all students should be getting educational services. So you've got these links. Take a look at OSPI's page on student discipline if you have questions. You can take a look at our discipline guide, which has been updated and is on our website under Learn About and on the publications page. I am going to move into a brief pop quiz on discipline to kind of highlight some of the additional important changes that have come up in the last couple of years and with the updated rules. I want to acknowledge first, we have our first question. And the question is asking about a child who's nonverbal and has autism. And there's been a crisis plan developed. And it looks like the crisis plan has been developed by the Children's Hospital and Autism Center together. And is the school required, or should the teacher follow the plan? It's a really great question. And I think one of the things that we can talk about in relation to that, especially if we get into functional behavior assessments and behavior intervention plans, which is that whatever kind of plan you call it, if it's a plan that could become necessary during the time the child's at school and you need to have the school's involvement in it, then typically what you would need to do is exactly that, involve the school, the IEP team in the development and agreement to the plan. And that the process of that development of the plan certainly could and should give consideration to the information and recommendations made by providers like Children's Hospital or Autism Center. But generally, sometimes families have received recommendations from outside providers, medical providers, that will say this child needs X, Y, and Z when they're in school. Schools take those as recommendations and things that they must consider, but not necessarily must follow unless through that process the school agrees that those are what are necessary in the school setting. So remind me, and we can come back to that a little when we dive into functional behavior assessments and behavior intervention plans. But let's do a pop quiz, because who doesn't like a quiz? And since I haven't figured out necessarily how to do the poll question, you only have to answer if you want to, and you can throw something in the chat box. What's new with school rules? Again, our state school discipline rules have been updated. Just this summer was the final publication of the revised rules. And one of the changes was around notification to parents when there's a disciplinary action. So here's our quiz. When should the school notify parents? Should the school notify you? And remember, parent, I apologize, let me pause in the middle of a sentence. In part one, I remember to include the slide that gave the definition of parent when we're talking about special education. And the reason that's important is because it is defined broadly, and it includes biological parents or foster parents or other people acting in the role of parents. And then it explains what to do if there's more than one person involved. So as I use this word parent, please understand that it's meant to include the variety of people who serve in that role of parent and care for kids. So back to our pop quiz. When should the school notify you? When a student is sent out of the classroom for misbehavior, each time the student is sent out, that's number one. 2, when the student's given a short-term suspension. C, A, B, C, when a student's given a long-term suspension, expulsion, or emergency expulsion. Or D, all of the above. Any other votes? We have a couple Ds. And both of those answers get an A+. You're absolutely right. It is D. And the answer is all above, all of the above. And the change here is around a requirement for notification to a parent each time there is a classroom exclusion. This is big, right? Because it's been clear that parents needed to get notification if there was going to be a suspension, short-term, long-term, whatever the case may be. And many schools have the practice, certainly, of notifying families, say if there's going to be a detention, a lunch detention, or after school. And many also, if there's something other, maybe less significant, they keep families closely informed. But one of the big changes this year in the school discipline rules is that schools must notify parents when a student is removed from the classroom for behavior violations. And this is now called a classroom exclusion. There is guidance on this on the OSPI webpage that defines what that is, that gives the specific parameters. I wanted to highlight this because one of the things that can come up, and sometimes particularly for a child who has a disability, is that if they're perceived as being disruptive in the classroom, they may be sent out of the classroom. They may be sent to the hallway. They may be sent down to the principal's office. It may be for the rest of the class period. It may be for, it may happen several times a week. It may happen just in one class or in several classes. If that is starting to happen, it should be a signal, an alert to say, how are things going? Do we need to take a new look at supports or accommodation? And now parents should be informed each time it does happen, so the parents can weigh in and say, I think it's time to take another look. I'm concerned about this. I think it's a pattern. And we have a question, would this apply to a child with autism in a self-contained classroom? And the answer is yes, it would apply to any student in any kind of classroom setting. So whether you have a child with autism who's in the general ed classroom for part of the day and their general ed teacher sends them out because they're disruptive, it would apply. If they are in a special ed classroom, in a self-contained classroom, and that teacher sends them out because they're disruptive and their classroom behavior violations, it would apply. So again, there is a specific definition of classroom exclusion, and OSPI has developed guidance around this. What I would hope to encourage for families and schools is that school districts right now and over the next several months are going to be in the process of updating their student discipline policies and procedures. In fact, one of the requirements with the new discipline rules is that school districts do that update and review and revision of their district level policies on student discipline, and that they involve community in that process. So this is a time, if you have any bandwidth to try to engage on a district policy level, to reach out to your district and find out where they're at in terms of the review of their discipline policy. For example, districts will have to decide, is it going to be each teacher who needs to call the parent and notify, I've removed your child from the classroom? Is that going to be for the principal? What are the other things that they're going to put in there to make sure that these things happen? And so it's a time to be in communication with the schools and with the district about how they're going to make this work. I think this is going to be a lift in some schools and some districts, and they're going to be working through it. So knowing that this is part of the rules can help you as family members and other people who are working with kids in schools. If everybody knows this is what we need to be working towards, you can ask about this and ask about how, how they're going to be able to keep you informed. And again, if you are receiving notice frequently that a child's been removed from a classroom for behavior, then that starts to get us into later sections of this webinar of looking at, do we need to do something to better understand what's going on, and what we could do differently. So yes, it applies all kids. These are the general school discipline rules, and they apply to all kids. One thing I want to test out with you now, just before we move on to the next pop quiz question, is can we take a peek right there? I think last session we did this. We went right over to the special ed rules. So now today, it looks a lot like those pages that I took you to last session, but this one is a different section of our state rules, and this is the student discipline rules. So if you're looking at this now, you're looking at a lot of text. And right here, 392, 400, 335, it defines precisely what is a classroom exclusion, notice, and procedure. So actually the definition is up here. Classroom exclusions, conditions and limitations, how long it can last, right? If it's going to last more than the class, they need to refer it to the principal to make a decision, or the principal's designee about longer discipline if that's needed. And then it talks about notice. So this is where you can find this language. If I personally don't find it very practical to try to memorize it all. So again, I try to bookmark this and take a look at it if something comes up and refresh my memory. What was that precisely? When do they need to give notice? What is that going to look like? And then circle back to the school and say, you know, my kid told me that they were out in the hallway for part of class, and I'm wondering if you can follow up and tell me, was that a removal, a classroom exclusion? And then I'd like to hear about why, and make sure that if it does happen again, that you'll let me know, because if it becomes a pattern, I want us to be able to address it. So that might be a way to approach it. So let's see if we can get back to our slideshow. Here we go. So pop quiz number 2. And let's see if we have, all right, we have another great question. Just before I go to number 2, you can read the question if you want. Does processing count? Students are sent out to reflect on action, and when they fill out the process form, they can return. This results in lunch detention for first offense. This is a really great question, and what we would have to do is refer back to those rules and the precise definition, because I think indeed it may count. Processing may count as a classroom exclusion. And the reason would be if the student is removed from the classroom for a behavior violation, unless the teacher stays with them, right, and it's for a really brief time, then that's a classroom exclusion. And so what this means is not that schools cannot use the processing time, because indeed that may be an effective and appropriate strategy. What it means is they must inform the family that they're using it and that it's happening, right? So again, it doesn't mean they can't do that. And I think this is one of the things that some schools have said, which is that part of a positive behavior intervention system, or PBIS, may well be that you have students leave the classroom and process and think about what they've done. So now what this means is that when that happens, the school is going to need to inform the family. Not an insignificant thing for schools, because they will need to inform the family of every child who is sent out, right? But again, it is designed to make sure that there's real transparency and clarity around what's happening. Because you can imagine, so here's what I try to imagine. If there's a child who a teacher sends out for processing once or twice over the course of a month, that may just well be part of their learning. If there's a child who is sent out for this processing multiple times a day or every day in a week, that is significant, and it's important for the family to be able to know about that, because you're a part of the team that determines and checks and monitors how a student's doing and whether they're making progress, and in an appropriate setting with appropriate supports. If the child's out of that setting that frequently, it suggests that maybe that team needs to get back together and say, do we need to do something different? Okay, back to the quiz. All right, number 2, when a student with an IEP, currently under the new school rules, is given a suspension or expulsion, when should the school provide support for them to keep up while they're out? Should it be A, when the student is out for any suspension or expulsion, including short terms and emergency expulsions? B, starting right away, but only if they're going to be out for more than 10 days? Or C, after 10 days, if they're going to be out for more than 10 days. So when does support start under the new rules for education access? Okay, we have a little bit of mix here. We have mostly A's, and in this case, the answer is A. This was another one of the very big changes around student discipline rules in the last few years, and clarified with more detail around what this means in the most recent revision to the state discipline rules. And what the state legislature said in the changes to the discipline laws a couple years ago now was that you can't deny access to an education because of misbehavior, which is that even if a kid gets in trouble and is going to be disciplined, we're not going to punish them by denying access to an education. So what does that mean? That means if discipline in the form of suspension is determined to be appropriate, then a school needs to figure out how to otherwise give access to an education. And it means for any suspension, expulsion, or emergency expulsion. If you've been someone who's supporting a child with an IEP, it's probably been very familiar, or maybe has come up, that for any child with an IEP, the special ed rules say that if a child is out for more than 10 days for discipline, then the school district is obligated to provide services. But what the special ed rules say is if it's for less than 10 days, then the school is obligated to provide services only if, and to the same extent that they are obligated to provide services to all kids. Well, now our state law says, yes, all kids get services for any suspension or expulsion or emergency expulsion. So that means kids with disabilities as well, kids with an IEP or 504 plan. So when there is a suspension, expulsion, or emergency expulsion, the school should be working right away to say, how are we going to help give you access to your education to help you keep up? Now, what the most recent change to the discipline rules did was give some more detail. And what they explain is that if it's going to be 5 days or less, really it's essentially sending home the classroom work and homework and making sure that someone's available at the school so you can touch base with them to make sure it's happening. If it's going to be 6 to 10 days, then similarly, it's mostly going to be sending home coursework and checking in. But at that point, someone from the school should proactively reach out to you as the family, check in, collect homework, collect assignments that are done, turn them in, make sure they're graded, etc. Kind of keep things moving. If it's more than 10 days, then you're really looking at something more substantial. And again, if it's more than 10 days and it's a child with an IEP, then the school district needs to be providing services that allow a child to keep making progress on their goals. So it is specially designed instruction services, and continue to make progress in general education. That's one thing sometimes I'd come across where kids with an IEP were suspended or expelled long-term, and they were going to be out more than 10 days, and the district put together a plan for the alternative education services while they're out, but that those services at first included only specially designed instruction minutes because they were really focused on knowing that they needed to provide that specially designed instruction minutes. The special ed rules actually say that that alternative education needs to allow the student to continue to make progress on their special ed goals, their IEP goals, and also keep up in the general ed curriculum. So that means it really needs to cover all of that for a student who's going to be out longer. Hopefully they're not going to be out long. All students, including kids with IEPs, the goal really should be to have them return to a educational setting as soon as possible, return to school as soon as possible. And part of that is re-engagement planning. And re-engagement planning meetings are now required for any student who's suspended for more than 10 days or expelled, right? So any suspension or expulsion of more than 10 days, long-term suspension or expulsion. So there's a planning process. I'm going to pause for just a minute because we've got a couple of good questions. We have one question: are the day counts cumulative for the entire school year or event-based and consecutive? Typically, if you're just talking about a general suspension or expulsion, that's going to just happen once, and you're going to look at those number of days. However, there are limits on the number of cumulative days over the course of school year, and for especially kids in the younger grades, there are limits to the maximum amount. So I don't have these memorized, but we could take a look at the discipline regulations and find that. Also, for a child with an IEP, we've talked about that 10-day mark for the manifestation determination. The rules also explain that if there's been a pattern of removals that have similar behavior that add up to a total of 10 school days, then you could be hitting that mark for a manifestation determination. So sometimes it is cumulative. Sometimes you're looking at each separate one. If you're ever working with a child who has had repeated removals, suspensions, and they're really starting to add up, it's a good idea to double check the discipline rules and see what were those limits based on grade level. And then in addition to the rules and the regulations and the requirements, to just generally say, can we pause and take a closer look at what's going on here? Because we know that each suspension is a significant thing, and repeated suspensions just make it harder and harder to catch up and to be engaged. We have another question. If the child is suspended for more than 10 days and gets services like personal tutoring, that sounds really great. Would more kids want that? Does that get taken advantage of? So I think personal tutoring might sound great. In practice, a lot of times it's very limited in terms of hours, and it's isolating as well. So I think sometimes there's an idea of that one-on-one education or tutoring is kind of the gold standard. On the other hand, for young people, for many of them, the ability to engage with peers and other people, to be able to move around a school setting, to have some difference in their day is really valuable. And so being limited to an hour once or twice, an hour 2 or 3 times a week, or 2 hours a couple times a week with just one instructor can feel very isolating and also make it difficult to engage in some of the learning. And school districts are required to provide that service only when the school district has determined that they're going to suspend or expel a student. And so indeed, that decision to suspend or expel rests with the school or the district, not with the family. And while I know that sometimes there are kids who get to the point where, for various reasons, they just are getting in trouble, they see themselves as the troublemaker, they may appear to be just intentionally getting themselves removed from school. Most kids, and I think even those who most seem like they don't care, most kids want to do well and want to be able to be a kid who's successful. And part of being successful as a kid is typically involves making your way through school, whether or not you're at the top of the class, at least being there. So I think I haven't heard of the service being taken advantage of. I do hear that there are some real challenges to access because sometimes there's issues around transportation. I think for school districts, it certainly is a cost. And so for many of them in this process, they're looking not only at how do we provide those services, but also what can we do to limit the number of circumstances where we really feel like removal from the school setting is necessary. And then, and here let's return to the slide that we're resting on, how can we get them back in a positive way where they're ready and we're ready to have a different kind of relationship and different kind of outcomes and better outcomes so that we don't return to this situation of suspension or expulsion. And that's re-engagement planning. Re-engagement planning, again, it's required for any long-term suspension or expulsion. It needs to be a process where schools engage with family in a culturally relevant and responsive way. For kids with an IEP, I think one of the things that I worry about a little bit, and I hope that people supporting individual kids will keep their eye out for, is that there's already a lot of process around IEPs, right? There are different meetings that are required. We've spoken about the manifestation determination meeting. We know there are IEP meetings required. It might be easy to forget or to skip over a re-engagement planning meeting for a child with an IEP because you're having so many meetings. I certainly can see it would make sense to combine it with something else because people are busy, but I would hope that it's not skipped over because there's some really key questions around re-engagement about what happened, how did we get here? What might we want to do differently to avoid getting to this situation again? It's a chance to check in about the relationships between the student and the adults and whether there's any way to do some repair around that relationship. It's also a chance to check in on generally, how is the student doing? What does their academic progress look like? How are other things going? And again, I know those are often questions that are wrapped up in an IEP, but specifically taking some time to pay attention to, again, the relationship, the connection, what pulls the student into the school, what helps them be successful when they're there. The re-engagement planning process can be a place to have that kind of conversation and attention. So we're about to move into more specifically the manifestation determination. Just before I do that, I just want to reflect again on these sections that we've been looking at, and let's see if we can turn quickly back over to the sections of the regulations. We've been talking specifically about student discipline regulations. I've scrolled up to the top here. These are the updated regulations that come under Chapter 392-400 in our state administrative code. They're about student discipline, and they include all kinds of details around the requirement for the development of policy and procedures, who has authority to do discipline, short-term, long-term expulsion. It defines classroom exclusions. It defines the appeal process, all of that. All of this applies to all students, and that includes kids with IEPs. As we dive into the stuff that adds additional protections, just again to emphasize, those are in addition to all of this. So all of those protections apply for them as well. So let's jump back to our presentation. If there are any other questions about the general discipline rules and big changes, or any other significant changes that you've heard about and you want to make sure that other people hear about, please feel free to add those to the chat or the Q&A, and we'll move into manifestation. So we've talked about this a couple times already. If a child with an IEP or a 504 plan is to be removed from school for more than 10 days, that triggers a requirement that a team gets together and holds a manifestation determination meeting. At that meeting, there are two questions to start with. You look at what the behavior was, and the first question is whether that conduct or behavior in question was caused by or had a direct and substantial relationship to the student's disability. You have to answer that question, yes or no, as a team. The second question is, was the conduct in question the direct result of the school district's failure to implement the IEP? If you're in this meeting and the group agrees that indeed this conduct was a manifestation of the disability, so we answer yes to the first question, sometimes there feels less pressure to answer the second question about whether it's a direct result of a failure to implement the IEP. I think sometimes families feel in a situation where there's been a significant behavior or conduct, an escalation or behavior that's out of the ordinary. They sometimes will share that they feel like if the school had been providing these different supports, it wouldn't have happened. And so you'll get to that second question of, was this a failure to implement the IEP? And the question really is, was it a failure to implement the IEP as written, not as it maybe should be written? So that's the key thing. So let's say after this incident, if everybody agrees that a new support is needed, that's an appropriate thing to look at and make a decision about. But agreeing that something should be added is not the same thing as saying that something that was already there didn't happen. These questions, again, they're answered by the district, the parent, and relevant members of the student's IEP team, and that relevant members is determined by the parent and the district, based on all relevant information in the student's file, including the IEP, teacher observation, information provided by the parents. This is a key thing, because another thing that might happen, right, is that a significant incident, a blow up, might be actually a moment that kind of crystallizes concerns that have been building and reflects something that might be a little bit new about the student, something that's changed or has become more clear. So say, for example, you've had a student whose IEP is based on a specific learning disability, like a challenge with reading or writing, but they've really been struggling, maybe showing increasing anxiety, and that the incident seems to be really based on a response to that, or maybe it's that the family has been able to now go through a process and identify that this child has ADHD, and that what people have maybe suspected has now been diagnosed. And I've heard sometimes in those conversations in a manifestation determination, well, the eligibility category here is specific learning disability in reading, and that didn't cause the conduct, so we would say no. But this piece about the determination needs to be based on all relevant information, including information that the parents might bring or observations, means that now that you have that information, you can't ignore it. And so if that was an impulsive reaction and it was caused by or had a direct relationship to the ADHD that you're just now starting to understand, then you would still answer yes. And at that point, you'd say, if we haven't yet, we need to do a functional behavior assessment. That's an FBA, functional behavior assessment. And then if no, if you say it wasn't a manifestation, then you still do an FBA as appropriate. There's a question, does this manifestation determination process occur with 504 plan students? And the answer is yes, it should. And the reason is, again, because it's the same kind of question. We want to make sure that those students are not punished for something that's caused by a disability, and also thinking about that the disciplinary consequence may not be effective or may be more clearly ineffective if what we're addressing here is a disability issue and not something else. So yes, this manifestation determination process applies for kids with IEPs and for kids with 504 plans. So if the manifestation question is yes, then FBA is required. If no, then an FBA should be done as appropriate. And that as appropriate question, sometimes this comes up. So when we're talking with families and schools, if there's been a concern about a student being removed from class or being suspended, there's behaviors that are getting in the way for that individual student or for others, there's this question, what should we do? And sometimes the first answer is from the teacher, let me try these different interventions or responses, or, you know, we're going to do a in-school suspension or whatnot. At some point, when the behavior is really getting in the way of the learning of the child or others, and there isn't an understanding necessarily of where it's coming from, what it's based on, or the team hasn't been able to identify effective responses or interventions, then it might be time to think about doing a more formal process of an FBA, a functional behavior assessment. Certainly, I've talked with families and school teams where a parent might request that the district do an FBA, a functional behavior assessment, and that they'll hear, no, we don't think it's necessary. And I think those responses come when an acknowledgement that it certainly is not without a cost in terms of resource and time and staff effort to do an FBA, and certainly a good FBA, because it involves taking data, doing observations, sometimes other assessments, right? Because you really want to understand all the things surrounding the behavior, the environments where it occurs, what they call ABCs, antecedent, behavior, consequence, what comes right before, what the behavior looks like, what happens after it, what are the natural consequences. So it is something that takes time, it takes effort and resource. And so if there's a sense that the behavior is not significantly interfering, or that they're have identified interventions and they're giving them a try and they're working, they may say, we don't think it's necessary. But it is certainly something that a parent can request. And I do think, as in most other circumstances, that it's a really good idea to request in writing. And that because an FBA, looking at a particular child and whether or not they might need some different interventions and supports, is a type of evaluation when we're talking about kids with an IEP, then that's something the parent can request. The district should respond in writing with the response. Now, that response from the district might come after you have a chance to get together and talk it out and figure out, do we really need to do this? Yes, okay, here's your written response. No, I don't think so. Here's your written response explaining why. But it should be in writing. The other thing is, if it's the district that either agrees in that process or proposes to a parent, we want to do an FBA for your child, again, because it's a type of evaluation, they should start by asking for written consent. And that is helpful because it gives you a moment to talk about, how are we going to do this? A functional behavior assessment could be done by the teacher that's in the classroom. So we'd had some questions earlier about a child who was in a self-contained classroom, a child with autism, a nonverbal child with autism. So if that child were still struggling and experiencing lots of disciplinary actions or behavior interventions, and they were still struggling with that to get an appropriate, effective support plan, then it might be that you'd want to ask for a functional behavior assessment for that child, or an updated functional behavior assessment. And the question would be, who's going to do that? Is it going to be their current classroom teacher? Would it be the school psychologist? Might it be an autism specialist that the district has on staff or that they could contract with? That kind of conversation is important to have, especially if there's reasons why you'd want to have someone else come in and do it, right? If it's going to be a lot of data collection, if you want someone with particular experience or expertise. So you can have that conversation and then review the consent paperwork. Then, after a functional behavior assessment is done, what it really should do is help you get a clear picture of the kind of behavior you're talking about. This slide looks at behavioral intervention plans and some things to think about and look for if you're involved in that process of reviewing the functional behavior assessment and then developing a behavior intervention plan. And absolutely, if you are caring for a child and the child has an IEP, the development of a behavior intervention plan is a task for the IEP team that includes families. And the review of the functional behavior assessment is a task for the team that would include the family. So it's absolutely something you would expect to be involved in if it's going to happen for your child. And it's, as with other evaluations, I think it can be helpful to ask that you get the copy of the draft written report in advance of the meeting so you have a chance to take a look through it and think about what questions you have. As you go from the behavior assessment into development of an intervention plan, some of the things that people highlight as important are making sure that the plan addresses a specific observable behavior. So I don't know if anybody who's signed in tonight works with a child or supports a child, has a child with a behavior intervention plan. But if you were to pull that out now or after the webinar and take a look, how does it describe the behavior that it's intending to address? Is it something that's vague, like the student loses her temper and engages in destructive behavior, or another one might be aggressive behavior, or throws a tantrum, right? Those are things that when I say those out loud, I might have a picture in my mind, but it could be very different than the picture that other people come up with when they hear that. So the key is to see if it defines something very specific and observable that you could look at and two other people could look at, and you'd all know you're looking at the same thing. Clenches fingers, screams, yells, throws items, right? The other thing is, looking at those plans, it's important that they identify the behavior you want to reduce and eliminate. It's really important as well that they identify the replacement behavior, the behavior that's appropriate, that's going to get to the same ends. So a lot of times these behavior assessments hypothesize, is this behavior to get attention? Is it to avoid something? Is it to get something they want? And the idea is that the purpose of the behavior or the function is not necessarily a bad thing, right? Getting positive attention is something that we all want, and we talk about needing to give that positive attention to kids. What we want is for kids to seek positive attention in an appropriate way for the school setting. So what's the appropriate replacement behavior that's going to be taught? How are they going to do things differently to reduce triggers? And then a key thing is that a behavior intervention plan is something that should be tracking this behavior and the replacement behavior and then periodically reviewed. So is it clear about how data is going to be collected and when you'll get together to review it? Those are just some questions to look at, especially if you've developed a behavior intervention plan, but you're still feeling like things aren't quite where you need them to be, with the child being able to engage with instruction on a regular basis without disruptive or inappropriate behavior interrupting that. When you're looking at behavior intervention plans, one of the things that sometimes happens is that you get really focused on the behavior intervention plan, and that's appropriate. You need to give real focus and think about the definitions and all that. It's also really critical to remember that the behavior intervention plan is a part of the IEP. It's incorporated into the IEP. And so it needs to make sense with all the other pieces of the IEP. It's also a really great time to think about whether any of the other sections of the IEP might need some adjustment to help meet the goals that you're looking at with the behavior intervention plan. So let's be specific. Let's say part of the behavior intervention plan deals with inappropriate use of a computer or a laptop, right? If the child is using a laptop or computer for some of their educational work, are there any assistive technologies that could be built in that help kind of put some guidelines or guardrails around the use of the computer, right? So you might look at that. Let's say if there is an accommodation or a modification that you need to add. Let's say you're talking about a child who has avoidance behavior and they've been eloping or running out of class without telling the teacher, without getting permission. It may be that you want to allow that child to take a break for a while, right? But that you want to make sure the break is done in a safe way. So you're going to say, okay, you just hold up this card and you can go and the counselor will be there. You might want to go through the IEP and in that section of accommodations say an accommodation is break cards for when needed, right? So work on the behavior plan, but also take a look at the other sections of the IEP to see if they need updating and modification to continue to support that behavior intervention plan. We're talking about behavior intervention plans, and sometimes the behavior or the conduct that they might need to look at is stuff related to attendance. Attendance is really in focus these days in our state, and looking at both excused absences and unexcused absences. A side note, our state recently updated the definition of absence and excused absence. And it has changed in significant ways. And one of the things, though, that is important to know that unexcused absences or excused absences, the person who decides whether something fits within excused or unexcused if it's not crystal clear, is the school principal. And so sometimes this comes up in the form of, well, I called to say they were staying home and they were sick and they weren't going to go in. That doesn't necessarily mean it will be marked as excused. It must fit within one of the definition categories and as determined by the school principal. If there are disagreements over that, it should be possible to have a conference to talk it out. Sometimes kids end up with enough unexcused absences that our state's formal truancy process is triggered. One of the things that I want to highlight for kids who have an IEP or might need one is that in a year or so ago, our state legislature changed the truancy law to specifically say what happens is if any student gets to 2 unexcused absences, the law says there are certain steps a school needs to take to really try to figure out why is the student being absent, and are there barriers, and what can we do to try to reduce those absences and keep the student engaged with school. That's for all kids. And now what the law specifically says to schools, hey, look, if this child who has 2 unexcused absences is a child with an IEP or a 504 plan, get that team together to talk about what is at the root of the absences. If you need to, include a behavior specialist or a mental health specialist. If you have a child who's developed school phobia or anxiety around school, if you have a child who is just really struggling with social dynamics at school, and you need to be able to understand that IEP team or 504 team is a group that should know this child, and you have tools. You can look at evaluations or reevaluations. You can look at accommodations and supports. You can really try to drill down to understand the reasons for the absences. If it's a child who doesn't yet have an IEP or a 504, but might, then that's a time for the district to remind families that you can request those evaluations at no cost. So if you're dealing with a child who's struggling to get to school regularly, then really think about the IEP team or the 504 team as a problem-solving place. If you've struggled with that, then there are some strategies to try to make that process work well. And I'm going to quickly look at academic progress. So this one I'm going to give a little bit of short shrift to. I apologize because we're getting close on our time. But if you are wondering if your child is making academic progress, take a look at the goals in the IEP. For every single goal in the IEP, you should get periodic progress reports. And those progress reports should be specific. There's been some nice guidance out of the State Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, OSPI, recently, that has examples of what a progress report can look like to give real good information about how the student's doing. Are they making progress or not? If not, do we have an idea why, and are we going to change something? And so take a look at progress reports, check to see if they're making progress in the general ed curriculum. And so sometimes students are in specialized settings, but still should be able to access the general ed curriculum. And that might be particularly true for kids who have primarily challenges with behavior. So take a look at that. Sometimes it can be a behavior issue that's impacting academic progress, and you might be circling back to those questions about an FBA. I just wanted to put this in to quickly remind a lot of this stuff that we're talking about for a child who has an IEP, these are issues that the IEP team can and should tackle when they come up. But what do you do if your team is not reaching agreement? If you meet, you're trying to work on an issue, say it's related to attendance or behavior, and you don't reach agreement or consensus, the rules say the district has to make a decision. And then they have to inform parents in writing with a prior written notice. The district has to make a decision because ultimately the district is responsible for providing free, appropriate public education. At that point, they give a notice, and the notice needs to include information about the parent's rights to challenge that decision if you disagree. The prior written notice should come anytime the district proposes an action or a change or a parent makes a request. If you get to that notice or you're in disagreement, there are a number of options that range from informal to more formal for trying to resolve disagreements. And I'll tell you, we're at 7 o'clock and we're just now starting this conversation. And it really could be its own hour of ideas for how to work through disagreements. Because you might start by saying, let's take a little time. We don't agree on this yet, but maybe there's some more data we could collect to try to get to a shared understanding of what's going on. You might say, I need to reach out to someone else. I want to personally understand more about my options, or I want to see if someone can engage this communication with us. So it might be OSPI has a family liaison. It might be our office. It might be PAVE or ARC or your colleagues or friends there that you've connected through Fostering Together. You can ask for a facilitated IEP team meeting. That's a service the state provides. Or you can ask for mediation. Formal options are citizen complaints, due process, or complaints with the Office of Civil Rights. Could you do another with this as a topic? I think that's a fabulous question. I would certainly be glad, and I think Jill and I will be in conversation about that, because this is key, right? And all the things that we've talked about, from a behavior assessment to a manifestation determination to whether you could change other sections of the IEP, when classroom exclusions, all of those can be areas where disagreements come up. And that when there's a significant discipline incident, when there's a significant incident where a student has become really dysregulated, or if there's disagreements over really what's happening, who's doing what, those can be not only moments of disagreement, but pretty intense emotional moments, right? Where there's frustration, fear, and worry. And so I think it's a tough thing and worth taking time to talk about, because there are resources, and here are some on 504 and some general tips. So let's do that. I promise to circle back with Jill and consider and explore whether we could do another session specifically on ideas for resolving disagreements. I hope this has been helpful. I'm going to go ahead and wrap us up. We're 3 minutes overdue, not quite 3. We are going to post this online later. What my colleague adds closed captioning and then post the video, and we'll post the PowerPoint as well. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and watch for a survey if you don't mind. We'll try to get your feedback, and thank you. Enjoy the rest of your evening.